quotes didn't really matter to that.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about a green stick.
Green stick, yeah, the green stick. Anything else that stood out from last week? Nothing. It was that boring.
I liked when we were talking about his quote. I like how you share a quote each week.
Mm-hmm. Did anyone take the time to have a conversation with their parents or anyone else about the quote this week?
I did not.
You did not? Okay. No, you don't have to. I do send them to your parents, so if they want to, they can engage in that conversation with you. What else? I talked about quite a bit, so.
I liked how you were talking about in his books that he would talk about the corruption of the soul and how to deal with that.
Yeah. So pretty main theme that we will find throughout all of the course that we talk about will be that concept of the corruption of the soul, which was a pretty prevalent, actually, form of thought in Russian culture as a whole. We'll see that as we talk about his relationship with Dostoevsky and how that kind of permeates throughout his whole life. But that's a really important one, I think, for us to be mindful of in our own lives and reflexive, because again, the point of studying history is not so that we have facts or figures, but so that we can apply what we learn from others in our own lives. Anything else?
We talked a lot about, from his quotes, that he writes a lot of good quotes, but like in his life he didn't really follow them.
Mm-hmm.
So
Also with him having like trouble being an orphan and thinking that his parents loved him and
Yeah,
they wouldn't help him, and how life would be if he did have them.
pretty major theme. He was orphaned, right? Parents died. So imagine, if you will, for a moment, how to navigate life had your parents died when you were 2 and 9. Significantly different life than you're living probably currently, right? Those are things that will certainly set you back. All right. So this week we had a writing prompt. Does anyone want to be brave enough to share their opening paragraph?
Okay.
I'd like to share as well.
Kayla,
I can share as well.
Yeah, whoever wants to. We got extra time thanks to Noah.
Noah and Elaine.
Emily. Yeah, go ahead, Kayla. Why don't you start?
I am but a man with the loneliest soul. Everyone around me tries to want the best for me, but ends up hurting me instead. When I'm around, they say I'm grand, but yet when I'm not there, they wish I'd stay away. I forgot to write down his name. I have to think of a good name for him.
Okay.
So, and I am a lonely man. Come here and I'll help you to understand.
Okay. Good opening paragraph. Strong. Does that create any interest in anyone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's a good opening. It draws you in. It gives you some understanding of the context a little bit, but not so much that you've figured it all out. So it's drawing you in. Yeah. Go ahead, Kate.
That Russ is a crab?
Clam.
Clam. Okay, I have to find it. Can someone else go? Because I
Sure.
think everybody
Elijah,
else
why don't you
knows
go
what I
ahead?
mean.
Okay. First entry. What is a man without his emotions? What is a human if not jostled and turned, molded and driven by the ever-operational fervor at work within? We are all a weight on the scale that has tipped this world into madness. Not one clean of blood on their hands. The night was cold as I read these words. The cool breeze blew its sharp chill along my brow. 42 times I thought to myself, yes, 42 times I've laid my eyes upon this woeful passage. Each time hoping some new meaning would come through it. With each word, hoping some grander solution would be found. No. Once more, I find no more than nothingness and despair.
Good. Interesting. Draws your attention. Good. Very well done. Okay, go ahead.
It was a hot fall morning in the tide pool, and the clam was looking at all the new creatures that got stuck in the tide. I meant to put pool, but I forgot. In the tide pool. A mitten crab, a blue-ringed octopus, and a little sardine. "Hello, Mr. G," said his neighbor, Miss Shelley the crab. "Good morning," he replied. Later, the curious little sardine came to meet him. "Hola, Señor Clam," he said. "Please," said the clam, "call me Glasses."
Good.
That's so
Interesting.
cute. That's very cute. That's so cute.
Different tone, right? So we went from a more foreboding to a little bit more lighthearted. And so that will reflect, likely, experiences. And so I think, so let's examine that, right? Because we're examining the life of an author. So what do you think with Elijah's, because we're going to use these to compare, and we'll get to the other ones here in a minute. What do you think, when you hear Elijah's, what do you think about Elijah? What is something we could assume to be true about him by listening to what he wrote?
He's a very considerate person.
Considerate.
I would say that he knows how to write a good story.
He knows how to write a good story.
How to pull you in.
Mm-hmm. But what more specifically in the writings? We tend to write, just so you're aware, I think you should be aware of this, we tend to write based on our experience of life, how we perceive things. Very good writers write from a central point in their life or a central understanding. So one of the things that I would say is probably true, I know it's certainly true because I've had experience with Elijah, is that he's thoughtful and he's questioning and he's wrestling, right? The whole kind of first paragraph there was really this kind of wrestling dynamic. And yeah, it tells a good story, it draws you in, it makes you kind of wonder, 42? What is 42 going to represent? That's got to represent something. And I'm sure he'll maybe get to that. Now, cadence, on the other hand. So when we read cadence, what may we interpret or understand about Caden?
He's very creative.
Creative, yep.
He likes animals.
Likes animals, yeah. He could have a deep love for not just any animals, but in this case, it sounds like aquatic animals of some sort.
Notices the tiny things that people don't really take into account that much.
That's a good observation, yeah. Notices the tiny things. There's a purity, is there not, in that kind of a story, right? There seems like a little bit more innocence, right? Even in the tongue-in-cheek way that the characters interact. And so again, we see obviously different age, right? Caden's writing to a little bit younger audience, you're writing to a bit more mature audience. But it gives us some insights into who the individual is. And it's really important. And it's one of the reasons why I want you to do some creative writing along with history class. Not that the creative writing part is historical in any way, but it helps you hopefully to formulate not only your thoughts on paper, but gives insight into who you are and what you think and how you wrestle with things. And having that mindset will help us a great deal in trying to understand Tolstoy, because as we saw, and we talked about it here again today, he was a man of conflict. What he said and how he lived didn't always match up, and that's a difficult thing to think about, considering he has a tremendous amount of wisdom that we can gain from, but certainly we don't want to emulate all of what happened in his life. So who else wanted to share?
I can.
Okay.
The sky was bright on this lovely summer day. The birds were already whooshing over the vast waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Linda, a 22-year-old bus driver, was getting ready to go to her 9-to-5 job. She was a very loyal driver, considering she had worked for the company for the last 10 years. As she was getting into her car, she got a phone call from her boss, and he said there's a fire at the bus station.
Oh, good.
Very
So
interesting.
interesting. Draws you in. Very authoritative, right? Very clear, concise.
Direct.
Direct. Good job. Okay. Anyone else wanted to share today? All right, well, I look forward to reading those. So let's move on with our quote. So this was another of Tolstoy's most famous quotes. He says this, it's a little shorter than the last few weeks. The two most powerful warriors are patience and time. Now, you don't necessarily have to write that down unless you want to, but what do you think that means? The two most powerful warriors are patience and time. That's the entire quote today. I know, it's short and sweet.
I think the way I perceive it is it's pretty much directly to what it's saying, because time in itself pretty much, though created by God, it still consumes everything. You can't escape it. And everything besides God himself are governed by time. And then patience goes into a lot of other things, because patience is a battle in itself, because there's a lot of different. Patience is never easy, because it's always something. Patience always seems like a long suffering of sorts, because it's a dying to self in a sense. So I could see why he could label them as warriors in themselves. So
Good. Other thoughts? The two most powerful warriors are patience and time. Anyone disagree? You think of more powerful warriors? Sure.
God,
God?
Spirit, and Jesus.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to ask ourselves in this context, right? What is, and Elijah alluded to it a little bit, is what do I define as a warrior? Yeah, he's after a very specific concept here, right? Time, and I think Elijah alluded to this really well, time waits for no one. Time continues to trudge along for all of us. We will all lose, in one sense, the battle with time. Safe to say, right? Eventually our lives will come to a discernible and a very distinct end. But patience is a different thing entirely when he's putting it in this context, because patience really has a lot to do with time. So time kind of here presents us with a primary force. And if we understand Tolstoy and his nature is to wrestle a lot with duality, two sides of things. In fact, we see that reflected in his own life. The person that he is and the way that he lives, the actually moving of his life is vastly different at times than some of his writing, and certainly some of his quotes. And so patience is something that we can do at times. It's one way of life that we can embrace time, right? Because we can live in the context of time with urgency and impatience, or we can wait. How many of you would say you're really good at waiting? You're super patient people. Kind of patient? How many of you would say I'm an impatient, impulsive person? How many of you like to ride the fence every time I ask a question?
What does that mean?
Ladder.
Right.
What does that mean?
Well, finding a middle ground. If you had to say you were, let's do it this way. So no sitting in the middle. You have to either be more on the side of patient or more on the side of impatient or impulsive. How many of you would say you're patient? So we're halfway to put our hands up.
I'm not sure.
How many impatient? All right. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about this, because we're going to talk today. We're going to begin for the next few weeks talking about how war really shaped Tolstoy quite a bit. So coming up again on the backs of some pretty significant childhood trauma, there's a lot of major events happening in Russian culture over the course of his life. And so you've got to imagine, this time historically, that Russian culture, by and large, was very particular and kind of separated out from the rest of the world. It was very insular. So you had Russian culture that was basically just its own thing. And where it's at geographically, it didn't really have a lot of the other more Western ideals in Europe, and certainly not America. They were kind of insulated from that thought. Well, right around the time that Tolstoy comes on the scene, he's born into, and there begins to be shifting in his early life, is kind of some Western ideals or Western thought is entering in. At the same time, we see historically throughout the world that major wars are kind of how culture was advanced. And so we see one particular war in the Caucasus, which is down by Turkey and that kind of area, where there was a war between the Russian people and the Ottoman and Persian empires. And so kind of the remnants of this old Ottoman Persian way, and Russia kind of standing up to that. But there was also this slight influence of Western thought coming from France and other parts of Europe. Now it's important for us to understand this in the context of war, because war generates not first from military might, but from thought. Right? All wars are wars that are fought with culture in mind. We have to think of every war as being cultural in nature. In fact, the very war that Tolstoy fought within himself was a battle between two cultures that he had in his own mind. No sneaking a peek here at the notes. We'll get back to that. So Tolstoy actually used two versions of himself that he reflected oftentimes in the lives of some of his main characters. The first is a good-hearted and passionate man, but who is kind of awkward.
Can I grab a napkin? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead. The second is a more brilliant and polished nobleman. And so you have kind of this good-hearted, poor, kind of just salt of the earth person, and somebody who comes with more prestige and honor. And so he used a lot of the play on this kind of concept because what we saw in Russian culture at the time is kind of going through some of the hiccups of monarchy and prestige and power and all of the rights that belonged to those who had. And then there was a very, very much so a really poor population of serfs. And he identified in between both of those worlds. And so again, we see within the context of the environment that he was around, this historical environment, that he was struggling. He was struggling with the man he desired to be and the man he was. And this was a struggle that was born out of, again, this orphan mentality, this orphan spirit, right? Not having parents, so not really fitting in. And so feeling like, in many ways, poor and a pauper. But because he came from a fairly well-to-do family, he's kind of got his foot in both worlds. And this will cause, again, continued struggle with him, in and out of what is right and what is wrong. And so before we continue, let's take a few minutes for a journal entry. So this is personal reflection now. This is not with your book. I want you to answer these questions. They're kind of they're combined here. What is a difficulty or challenge you had to overcome in your life, and how did you overcome this challenge? So reflecting on your own life. It doesn't have to be the most major event. I mean, if you want to be really brave and consider that for a moment. What was a difficulty, a challenge in any form or fashion? So it can be a big deal, it could be a smaller thing that you have to overcome. But let's take a few minutes to formulate that thought.
So do you want me to write down just what it was, or go more into detail about it?
It's up to you. This is strictly for your self-reflection. So you can write it down and then give at least some ways that you managed to help yourself overcome that. You can write it wherever you want. Well, that's a good question. Do you have to have overcome it already? No, it could be a current challenge that you're dealing with, and maybe some thoughts on how you think you can overcome it, or what are some steps that you're going to take to try to figure it out. Again, the point of these questions are not necessarily for my benefit, but for you to consider history and how history needs to be made a part of our understanding in our experiences. Let's just take another minute or so. Again, these would be good things to revisit. I would also highly encourage you, again, as we're going through this course, to be having conversations with others. Primarily your parents would be a good place to start for the wisdom that they have and insight that they have in your life. I'm going to read this quote again. The two most powerful warriors are patience and time. You will find in life, likely, the outcomes of your endeavors will be heavily influenced by your ability to be patient, by your ability to gain wisdom and understanding before moving forward. In fact, it is this very kind of way of life that Tolstoy here is trying to get at for us, an understanding of the need to be patient. Again, if we are prone to being impulsive types of people and we have problems, we might rush in to try to solve the problem without maybe considering the full consequence of the choice that we're making. On the other hand, if we're too patient, we may try to just avoid it by not dealing with it. All right. Does anyone want to share?
I can.
Okay, thank you.
A big struggle for me was moving to Washington.
Mm-hmm.
I managed to overcome it because of the people here and the beautiful scenery and the places to go and just in general.
So your solution to that particular struggle was something that was external to you. That was influenced really heavily by the people outside of you. Good. Anyone else? Maybe somebody who hasn't shared yet. I'm not going to say it's on this side of the room, but yeah, go ahead.
I've been struggling a lot with motivation and just keeping my mind focused, and I haven't fully overcome it yet, but I've prayed a lot about it and I've seen some help through that. And then also just finding like productive things to do instead of like sitting on my phone or not doing something that's more productive can help you to focus your mind. And also just while you're doing like your school or something, just putting any distractions in the other room. But yeah, and just like learning to manage your time.
Yeah.
That's kind of all I have.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a tricky one. Does anyone relate with that? Sometimes feeling unmotivated? Yeah. It's a pretty difficult battle to face because motivation is kind of important for movement. You know, at least one more person to share, please. Okay, thank you.
I think it's definitely a struggle for many people. For me, it was definitely self-discipline, and I definitely still haven't overcome it fully. But a few things has been trying not to rely on others to discerning of things, looking to a greater purpose over my own feelings, praying like Esther was saying, and reflection like creativity.
Good. Thank you. So we can all relate or understand on some level to the difficulties of life. Yeah. And I think in some level we all are pretty aware that at times the challenges of our life can be pretty draining, emotionally, physically. I think if we're all honest with ourselves too, at times in our life we really struggle with certain questions or certain things, and we go back and forth. And we can feel like two different people. This quote here, there's a more modern way to look at this quote, and it's more particular to sports. How many of you ever heard the saying of trust the process? Trust the process. Yeah. And kind of that mantra means like we're going to go about making this change, and it's usually like from like a leadership standpoint or something like that. To say trust the process is basically saying like you need to give us time, you need to be patient here, you need to understand that there's a way that we're going to go about doing it, and it's not going to be overnight. Things aren't necessarily going to change right away, but if you just trust what we're doing here, then I can promise you later on down the line things are going to change. Well, that's not too different than some of the language that we use even within the community itself, right? There's a pattern. There's a very specific pattern or a way of life that we ought to live. It's very clear, right? That there is an old pattern and a new pattern. Would anyone disagree with that? There's an old way of thinking, and then there's kind of this way that we should operate in. Like we're super aware of that. And we've been talking a little bit about that. Even in our own individual lives, we know that there's this old way that the reason I'm bringing up these difficulties, or we're talking about them, is saying, yeah, these are things that I would like to change about myself, or I'm glad I changed about myself, because the old way wasn't really conducive, it wasn't productive for me. So why are we discussing that? Well, again, one of the biggest issues throughout that marks Tolstoy's life is that he really has a difficulty in putting into practice a lot of this wisdom that he's experienced. And it's because he is the type, remember last week, that considered himself to be an orphan. And because he was an orphan, what did he say the solution was to dealing with the world?
Don't get involved.
Don't get involved. Withdraw. Stay away. Keep everything out there and draw back. Well, the problem is that historically, at this time, he wasn't doing that. He was living a pretty wild life, and he began to, because he had a little bit of money, he began to wager his money pretty regularly. Wager his money.
Wager is like gamble?
Gamble, yeah, betting on various different things. And as it turns out, he wasn't very good at it, so he lost a considerable amount of money. And so a man that was in need of money needed to find a way to gain that money. And so he followed his brother into the Caucasian War and began to be a servant there within different military ranks. Go ahead.
He was an infantry officer.
That's true. Yeah, and we'll get more into that as we advance onto some of the other wars that he was in. So he begins to go there to make some money. By this time, roughly, this war had been going on for about 30 years. So now again, imagine, wars not just being really quick to resolve. When we think of modern warfare, they tend to work themselves out a lot quicker. The modern context of this would be kind of our battles within Afghanistan and all of that, which has taken place over the last 20 plus years. Slow battles that are lingering. And so as he went off to war, he went into a territory that was settled by the Cossacks. Now, Cossacks were a very particular group of people who were a little bit more wealthy than a lot of the serfs or the peasants who were in Russia. And the reason for that is that they were, again, a pretty insulated group of people that were hardworking, that were very focused. They were really into like really cultivating the earth and living off of the land, and they were a tight knit group. In fact, they were a pretty accepting group because they would take in a lot of criminals, runaway peasants, and a lot of the more marginalized people of society would come and live in these camps. But there was a very simple way of life. Now, the Russian soldiers, because they were very, very far away from home, and at that time, right, we didn't have airplanes, we didn't have all of the technology of today. When you were gone for months and months and years at a time, and you had to have a place to stay. Well, they would stay within these small villages of the Cossacks, who too had fought against the Ottomans and the Persians. And the Cossacks were a very particular people because they had some very particular views about religion that was kind of pushed back at against both kind of the old pattern of Russia and the new kind of vision for advancing religion from a Christian perspective in Europe, where Europe and America kind of became more evangelistic and outgoing, and the ways of Russia was much more tied to old tradition. The Cossacks kind of pushed against both of them, and really their mindset was much more of a cultural group insulated within itself. Now, Tolstoy was really drawn to this. Why? Because he already had felt like an orphan, and this lifestyle really appealed to him. He was now in a war, not really that he wanted to fight necessarily because he wanted to have money, but he was observing this people group who were very, very insulated. And so it appealed to him in his emotional state to be very distant, away from everything. The problem is that he was dealing with the very same underlying issue that he had when he was a kid, and that is death. And so we see, we talked about it last week, that his life was a life that was marked by death. The proximity to death, always being around death. In fact, when he went to live here with the Cossacks, a lot of historians point to how he began to consider and observe how others lived so close to death, their own death. So we're talking about people who have grievous wounds on the battlefield who are coming and know that they're about ready to die within the next day or so. And Tolstoy, again, because he was kind of shrouded in this spirit, quite honestly, of death, he begins to kind of focus in and pay attention to how some people would brave death and really put up a good image and fight the fight and be brave in it. How some who would completely ignore it, even though they were dying or they're seeing their best friends dying, they would just distance themselves emotionally from it. And then how others just, how would they cope? What would they do? What were the different dynamics at play? This is a really shaping time for him because, again, his mindset is very, very focused towards death. Now, you guys read the first chapter, I hope, of the death of Ivan Ilyich. I mean, this book kind of alluded to, good. So this book alluded to, do you guys remember what were some of the responses to his death? For each individual, what did they think?
Glad it wasn't me.
Glad it wasn't me, yeah.
They were more than being sad that he died. They were like, oh yeah, I can get a new promotion.
Yeah.
I can get, they're for sure getting promoted, so I'll get promoted too.
Yeah.
They were like,
So they were posturing. So some people were like, didn't
Yes,
even really
this is
faze them.
really
They were
different.
more concerned about, Go ahead.
Only one of them showed up to even see him
Yeah.
and attend the ceremony.
Yeah, so one that, goes to the ceremony, yeah.
And like when Ken's talking about, I think the character is Peter Ivanovich or something.
Peter
When
Ivanovich.
he went, his friend was there, and he wasn't like acting like grieved or sad at all. He's like when he said when his friend was looking at him, he's like his look is telling me that just because this man has died doesn't mean we still can't have fun tonight. He's like, interesting.
Yeah. So kind of a weird mindset, right? To read that and go, well, maybe this Von Illich just wasn't a very good person. Maybe they just That's the normal response. But we see very, very clearly in there that one of the main points that Tolstoy is trying to make here has to do with this mentality of when they observed a death, there was kind of this like, well, it wasn't me. There's this emotionally distant kind of, it's not me. And even worse than that, and we'll get into this more into the book, there's this mindset of, well, I will never die. And so it is a complete throwing off of this, of dealing with death. This complete, like, ignorance to death almost. Intentional, like, distancing itself. Now this is really telling for us because Tolstoy was not of that mindset, primarily. He was much more of the mindset of really dissecting it and understanding it and getting at kind of the heart of what would happen. Tolstoy could never really truly avoid thinking about death. In some ways he was waiting for it, fearful that would come, but also in some ways we see in his early life he was desiring death. And so he put himself in positions where it didn't much matter. Well, again, how he mentally considered or thought about or observed death was pretty telling, right? Because it goes back again to how do we deal with the struggles of life? If you've been in this class, this is something for the older kids that they probably have heard in a different way. It stems everything. It stems from identity. Who we are shapes how we live. Not just who we are, but what we truly believe about ourselves. At the very core of how you see yourself, what you perceive to be true, will be the thing that you live out in practice. In fact, I can tell a lot about what a person truly believes by how they live. Now, how do we reflect upon this with Tolstoy? Really profound quotes. But looking at those profound quotes, can we have the fruit or the evidence that he truly believed those things? No. What we do know, though, is that this is a man who wrestled, again, with these two sides. And we'll see it in his most famous book, again, the side of war and the side of peace. He was shaped really significantly by the war that was going on around him. But the truth is anyone who was in that culture at that time was shaped by war. Now, nobody here has had to go to war, I think. Let me look around. I don't know what it's like. I don't know what it's like to have gone to war, thankfully. But I do. I am one generation separated from those who have went to war. My father went to war. My grandfather fought in wars. My great-grandfathers fought in wars. And so this topic is kind of somewhat something that we can insulate ourselves from, because although we might know about wars, and I think Noah talked about, let's throw in his class, because I think I overheard two different styles of like learning, right? There's the learning that you hear, let somebody tell you about, explicit, right? And so what would somebody who actually lived in the war?
It would be like
What was that? What was the
tacit.
tacit? Good. See how everything is working together here. And so I grew up in my life talking with my grandpa Jerome, who talked about, he was in the Air Force, the Jungle Air Force, and he was in the battles over in the Pacific Theater. You can stay focused up here, yeah, thank you. And so we're talking about like the battles of Midway around Pearl Harbor, and literally, I remember him recounting stories. He's on an island in the middle of nowhere, because there's a lot of islands in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific, and him remembering hearing a clack of a gun and seeing his friend shot and killed by a sniper. Now again, it's one thing to know that information, right? And go, wow, that would be hard.
That would be traumatizing.
It would be traumatizing. But can we truly put ourselves in that position without experiencing it?
You won't have the same experience as someone actually experienced
Right.
it.
Right. And so before we, and I'm bringing this up because before we get too critical here of Tolstoy, which could be really easy to do, to get into a conversation about how terrible a person he was because he didn't live the ideals that he spoke about. Let's keep in mind that he was shaped. He was shaped by the very real events of war and suffering and pain. And so far, so we can give it some historical context, none of us here have to relate to having a mom die when they were 2 and a dad die when they were 9. No one here has to deal with that context, right? None of us here have to deal with going into war and actually fighting against other people. Yes, sir.
I've also noticed that I've read a lot of books, and people that fight wars don't really want to live a lot of the time because they're so traumatized because they see all that stuff they don't want to live.
Mm-hmm. So even in that, right? There's multiple different people and how they will come away with, or discern, or understand, or deal with war. Tolstoy believed this. This is one of his beliefs. He believed that the ability to accept death was related to how strongly the person perceived their own uniqueness. And so if a person felt about themselves that they were really unique or had something of value to offer, that those types of people were much more likely to fight against death, to cope much better with dealing with death around them, to embrace life in a way that helps them to overcome. So if that is true, then what he is really talking about is people with a very strong sense of identity and purpose and destiny. That those are the types of people.
Can you say
who
that
are,
quote one more time?
Yeah, it's not a quote. It's just it's a general belief. Yeah, the ability to accept death was related to how strongly they perceived their own uniqueness. And again, this is on a shared document. I've taken the notes for you in advance so that you can review them.
Sir.
So this is again, it's important because if that is true, then what does it tell us about his own life? This kind of mindset that he had shows us a very conflicted person. A very conflicted person. Because in many senses, he had this drive to be something more than normal, than average. He desired to be a very unique person. But in many other ways, he didn't really hold himself up as having much value again. Now again, I want to highlight this because, again, as we're talking about his life, it is not a small thing that what has been taking place within our community, if you've been listening in on Tuesdays for the last few months, is dealing with this mentality or understanding of the orphan spirit. Now this is really something that is spiritually at play, right? And so we're studying history not just from a secular perspective, but throwing the layer of the supernatural, spiritual, how we discern and how we understand history from the perspective of our communal understanding. We would see that at play here, he is not dealing with the very soul, right? That he needs to put under, right? The inner man, that fleshly nature, that nature that really pushes against that which is right. And so we see somebody who has intellectually and emotionally held this standard up of an ideal of life that has a tremendous amount of wisdom. In many ways, we see that Tolstoy had a very good concept of a way of life. And yet he fails to fall in line with that. We read a journal entry, and we'll close up here pretty quickly. Let me read a journal entry from him. Talking about his own life, he says this: I am tormented by the pettiness of my life. I feel that it is because I am petty myself, but still have the strength to despise myself and my life. There is something in me that makes me believe that I wasn't born to be the same as other people. I am still tormented by thirst, not for fame. I don't want fame, and I despise it. But to have a big influence on people's happiness and usefulness. And he asks himself this question: shall I simply die with this hopeless wish? And so we see here again that he is tormented with these two natures that he sees within inside himself. This nature or this understanding that he is meant to be something different, something unique, right? Something that is set apart from all of those around him. But also struggles with wanting to be very simple and not make too much to do about himself, but also wanting to leave a really, really big impact. Remember, this is the same guy that says everyone considers how to change the world, but no one considers how to change themselves. See, what Tolstoy offers for us in many ways are questions that he could not answer in his own life. He asks these questions in books like The Death of Ivan Ilyich, which is a question of what is man's purpose in life? What is the meaning of life? How would you even define your life? And certainly he's going to use characters that will embrace this concept of death by ignoring it completely. And we ask ourselves that question is, how can you put in perspective what your life is if you can't properly discern or understand the end of things? I am tormented. That's not a small thing. Russian authors weren't given over to hyperbole. Hyperbole is when you overstate the point. Right? Like when you're a kid and you're a little hungry and you're like, I'm starving. That's hyperbole, right? How many of you have ever really starved? Well, no. But for him, we need to understand this, he's very directly tormented here. Now that word is not a word that is used lightly. And so again, before we judge him too harshly, let's consider the manner and experience of his life. 2 years old, the death of a mother that he never knew, but spiritually there's something happening, right? There's a loss. He cannot intellectualize it, but there's a loss that goes on. 9 years old, father dies. He goes to war. He observes again and again and again people dying. And what is particularly twisted him towards a very particular direction is that he becomes fascinated with death, but not a morbid curiosity of death, but trying to make sense of what death means in the concept of life. And he begins to formulate ideas in his mind about this whole concept of war. And how does man wage war? And what happens to individuals in the context of war? And this will deeply shape, profoundly shape the book War and Peace, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. And so this week, for our homework, a couple of things. And it's written down, and it's in the shared document again. The first thing is we're going to read the second chapter of The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Number two is I want you to write, so you have your own books that we're kind of formulating and we're kind of thinking through. I want you to write some thoughts on the struggle, a particular struggle that your character will face. Now, some of you have already kind of alluded to some of those struggles, but any good story, any really good story, if you think about it, it's not always just, well, why do we have that they lived happily ever after? Because they dealt with something in the middle. So any good story kind of has the introduction, you get to know the establishing of characters, but there's always kind of a linchpin, something that a problem they have to solve, a difficulty they have to overcome, some lesson that they need to learn, right? So I want you to begin to maybe think about that in your story, and it could be, again, doesn't need to be deeply profound. It could be very simple. So with some of you that have a little bit more coming from a tone that's a little bit more lighthearted, right? I'd imagine, Caden, what's the name of your book again?
Glasses in the Sardine.
Glasses in the Sardine. I'm imagining we're not going to deal with the deaths of many sardines fighting, major wars against, so it might be a little more like, so maybe the Well, maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe
Sardine
it takes a
Wars.
really weird turn.
The
So is this-
Sardine War.
Kind of like a comment
seagulls
to our
came
story, or
later
like
than
actually
So it doesn't have
part
to
of
be.
the
Yeah, it
story?
doesn't have to be part of the story.
Okay.
And again, the reason we're going to frame it this way is it's very difficult to write, and a lot of writers make the mistake of trying to write from the start to the end. Good writers don't write from the start to the end. They develop concepts and themes and motivations for the character. Well, we can't really understand where the character is going to go or how they're going to accomplish things if we don't understand the problems that they're going to face. So we have to have a context for their character. Yes, sir.
So you don't want us to write that in the book. You just want us
You
to.
can listen. You're free to write these are your books. I mean, you're free to write as much or as little as possible, as long as we follow the homework. So if you want to go ahead and do a bunch of extra stuff, by all means, this is something for you. And if you're just don't like to write at all and you're thinking like, this is my least favorite part of the class, like you're not going to offend me. Again, the point of us practicing this is to have the mindset of an author and looking at how really, from this particular class, as we're talking about an author, how our life is authored. That in many ways we are authors of our own story. But when we understand the proper perspective of that, we realize that we're not the author at all. That we should be submitted over to the author. Jesus is called the author and the finisher of our faith. Right? And so properly understood, we're doing a couple of things. We're hoping to download this particular pattern that we should follow from a very particular source, and we should begin to live it out. And that goes kind of in the face of how Tolstoy practiced his life, right? He had a tremendous amount of insight and wisdom. I would say spiritual wisdom. And even though he wasn't particularly a religious man, or wasn't particularly reaching out to the divine, or understanding the Father as we would understand him, there was no doubt an endowment of wisdom that the Father had given him. So regardless of his pursuit of the Father, there was a tremendous amount that was there. Well, but wisdom is not wisdom unless it's lived. And you're really not a wise person if you have a bunch of information stuck in your brain and you're not actually trying to live it out. And so the trick is, though, we come up against very particular things in our life, like I'm just not motivated. And what do we do with that? How do we manage that? Well, the way that Tolstoy would have managed it is he would have wrote a lot about it. And he would have lived very, very nominal amounts of it. So we're going to write the thoughts on the struggle that your character will face. And then thirdly, we're going to review, I think it's bullet number 2 on our syllabus that talks about the Decembrist revolt of 1825 for some historical context. And so next week we will be kind of putting a pin in talking specifically about Tolstoy's life, and we're going to talk about some pretty major events of war, because I want us to understand not just Tolstoy's life, but against the greater backdrop of Russian culture, what was taking place, what was the wars really about, because again, that will be something that influences pretty heavily how he writes moving forward. And so we will leave it at that. To give you guys kind of projecting forward, I want you to have this thought in your mind, because this class is going to be a little bit shorter than some of our others. I'm thinking right now we're probably going to be 8 weeks in Tolstoy. I'm not sure we'll go much more than that, because I don't think we need to overanalyze his life. After that, we're moving back to American history, which we're going to very specifically be talking about Manifest Destiny and the expansion of westward expansion. And so we've kind of left off with some revolutionary thought. This course of study will take us basically from the revolutionary time, moving all the way up into the Civil War. And then and that will be probably about a 12-week course. After that, we're going to jump into another biography. So the homework for you as well is to think about a particular person you might want to study, and maybe we can come to an agreement on that. And the reason I'm asking you to do that now is because it requires a tremendous amount of history. Is not just a thing you can just grab a book and read through and then throw it out there. It takes a tremendous amount of studying and discerning, and so I need to be. I've already worked on the American history part, but I need to start now, so that 4 or 5 months from now we're ready to do the next. So I'm ready to teach the next topic, so we're not just winging it. All right. That is it?
So wait, we're gonna look at the articles you put in the Google Drive on number 2.
Yeah, number 2,
Okay,
which,
okay.
yeah, the title of it should be the Decemberist Revolt.
Okay.
All of the videos or just one?
There's